Okay, so when you've not been out on your bike for a few weeks, it's really important that you take the time to spend 5 minutes and go over the basics. Your tyre pressure, your suspension pressure, the torque on the bolts on your bike, and also just basic things like making sure you've got a fresh chain and some brake pads in. It's really, really important. And there's a few little things, just like making sure that the seals on your suspension and your seat post are nice and fluid. That really makes a big difference as well. You should always check your tyre pressure before a ride. I like to use a tyre gauge like this one to make sure that I've got the right tyre pressure in my tyres. I always run a little bit less in the front than I do in the rear, because obviously the rear of the bike takes a little bit more of a pounding, especially with a full suspension bike like this. I'll run between 1 and 1.1 kilos in the front tyre and 1.2 to 1.3 in the rear. The second point that's really key to check is the suspension pressure that you have in your bike. Always run roughly 30% sag on the rear and a bit less on the front, about 20-25% sag. So what you have to do is you have to take off the dust cap here, attach the shock pump. And now I know that with this bike I have to be running 150 psi on the rear for my weight, no comments, which is the case. So just make sure I've got a little bit extra. And I always run about 80 psi with the new RockShox Lyric Ultimate fork on the front. Once I've done those two checks, I know that I'm good to go. So this next little check is to make sure that the chain has not stretched since it's been fitted to the bike. And so what I do is I fit it in from the 0.5 end and I drop this bit in. If this bit here drops in between the two links, then it means it's stretched. So I'm really lucky. My bike has got its chain is in good condition. I recommend changing them on the e-bike probably every 500k max, just to make sure that it's not stretched and it's not worn, to maintain optimal shifting. And so now what I can do is I can lube up the chain before the ride, because that's a really important thing. I put my chain lube on here and not on the top, because this is the part of the chain that's in contact with the cassette and with the chain ring, and so it makes more sense to lubricate the bits that are actually going to be touching. There we go. There you have it. I like using a torque wrench when I'm checking the tension on the bolts on my bike. What I do is I make sure we're set to the right level here, and then we fit the head in and we press down. Yep, so that one's good to go. And systematically I go over all of the 5s, the 4s and the 6s on the bike, just to make sure that everything's good. Obviously key ones being the front and rear axles and the suspension linkages. One little maintenance trick that most people forget is to put a little bit of suspension oil around the seals, on the seat post, on the rear shock and on the fork. And then what you do is basically you work it in to the seal to make sure that it's nice and friction free when you're riding. So here we push it in and then we make sure that it's working really well, so that the oil's nice and worked in. Do the same with the shock and with the fork. Once you've done that, of course you wipe any excess off and then your bike's